Hi, I'm Len Epp from Leanpub, and in this episode of the Front Matter podcast, I'll be interviewing Vagner Santana. Based in Yorktown Heights, New York, Vagner is a research scientist, certified data scientist, and master inventor at IBM Research. He has been developing software professionally for over 2 decades and is an expert in human-computer interaction with a PhD in computer science from Unicamp in Brazil. You can follow him on Twitter at Santana Vagner and check out his website at plasticdesign.eti.br. Along with Unicamp professor Maria Baranowskas, Vagner is co-author of the Leanpub book Interaction Data Analytics, Methods, Tools, and Applications. In the book, Vagner and his co-author present methods, tools, and applications you can use to understand and uncover the value of interaction data when people interact with computing systems, going beyond just measuring clicks. In this interview, we're going to talk about Vagner's background and career, professional interests, his book, and at the end, we'll talk a little bit about his experience using Leanpub and self-publishing. So thank you very much, Vagner, for being on the Front Matter podcast.
Thanks for having me.
I always like to start these interviews by asking people for their origin story. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about where you grew up and how you first became interested in computers and human-computer interaction.
Sure. Well, I'm Brazilian, so I grew up in a small city in the state of São Paulo, close to the capital of the state, which is also São Paulo. Well, I first got interested on computers because my old brother, he did his undergrad in computer science as well, and he started working really early with programming languages. So I believe that first time I saw a computer was like mid 90s. I did a couple of courses on DOS operating systems back then, and I. And a few times I saw my brother working on his notebook, and I got interested. And when I started learning in the more technical courses, just trying to understand how things worked and trying to make sense of programming languages, flowcharts that I was used to see back. And when I was living with my mom and my old brother at that time. And then, well, I noticed that I always had this, always liked to interact with math and these other more exact disciplines, right? And when I started for the first time, I was able to do some courses on programming languages and so also early mid 90s as well. And then I got this opportunity of working in the newspapers. A newspaper I worked called Folha de São Paulo. And at that time was only editing pictures. At that time was early, let's say, early age of the web, especially in Brazil at least. And I started working there, just doing some HTML and cutting and treating some photos for the newspapers. And then things got serious. I started doing lots of courses on programming languages, and 1 year later I was working as that time we call webmaster. Nowadays would be the full stack developer or something, and that's it. I started working as a webmaster there, and then soon after I just started college, which I did in São Paulo as well, in a university called Presbyterian University Mackenzie. And then I just didn't stop, right? I continue studying and did my master at Unicamp and PhD. And after that, I joined IBM Research, where I am. I've been at IBM for almost 10 years now. For 9 years, I was based in São Paulo. And then this year, I came to Yorktown Heights, working in a specific project for the next years. So I think in a short way, that's how I started. I got interested on computing. And we mentioned also about HCI. I think that I started to get more sense of HCI, especially like early 2000s. I started trying to get a sense, especially when I was working at this newspaper. It was like at the time one of the most viewed newspapers in Brazil. And at that time, they had a really good audience. So I started to be concerned about how people would access to try to make things always as easy as possible. Brazil is it's a developing country, so it has the same challenges concerning social, economical challenges we see in almost all developing countries. So at that time, I was worried about doing the right thing and trying to reach more people. So I started studying usability, accessibility, and then I got interested on these aspects more connected to HCI that at that time, I didn't even know that the name of this branch of computer science. And then when I was finishing my undergrad, I did what they call this project for the graduation. And I started studying more about the theoretical references behind HCI and how we can see guidelines helping people to how to make to creating more usable user interface. So, and after that, I got interested in reading some stuff and started publishing my first academic papers just at the end of the undergraduation. Got interested in pursuing my master and PhD degrees. And then after reading about different stuff, and I got super interested in this aspect of analytics because I had this feeling of how we can get data, especially coming from this experience in the newspaper I mentioned before, where it is possible to understand how people use this kind of system at scale, just analyzing how people interact with data, like analyzing logs. So I got really interested about this kind of data set at the time. And then when I was pursuing my master's degree, I tried to kind of combine some of the things that I got interested in. Like, what if I get this kind of data, but a more nuanced kind of data, or a more detailed, more details about interaction, but having in mind like accessibility and usability? What can be done? Because at that time I was already feeling that, okay, nowadays we only analyze clicks, but what happens between clicks is kind of interesting. Sometimes it's really important to understand what happened. And then I started to trying to understand what the values we can extract from this kind of data. And then it's how basically my interest on HCI got a really a space inside the community as well. And I also noticed that there was this, let's say, this gap on bringing more state-of-the-art of data analysis to some areas of HCI. So that's where I thought that I could contribute somehow, like bringing this data analysis mindset to this specific realm of HCI. So in short, that's how I got interested.
Yeah, thanks very much for sharing that story. I'm really interested in getting into sort of data and what you talk about, when you talk about things like what happens in between the clicks, right? Because, a lot of people, when they, they might, if they're into sort of like analysis of sort of interaction, the immediately thing you think about is like clicks per, things that people click on, how, how of all the things they see, how many of the, like, which one do they pick to click on, and things like that. So clicks and of course that's usually a sort of stat used in advertising pricing and stuff like that on the web. So that's why people would think about clicks. But before we do that, actually, I've got one of the sort of pleasures of this podcast and, sort of, being part of Leanpub is that we have authors from all around the world who have all these different experiences. And I wanted to ask you specifically about what how PhDs work in Brazil. I mean, if assuming there's a kind of general kind of way they work, right? Because it can be very different in the UK from the United States and Canada, for example. And I'm looking at your LinkedIn profile here, and I can see that your PhD is 2009 to 2012, and that's more of a UK style timeline than an American one, which might be like 6 or 7 years or something like that. So I was wondering if you could just explain a little bit about, are you all but dissertation from day one? Are you expected to teach and take classes when you do a PhD? Things just how does it work?
Sure. I didn't mention that how was my transition from the work I was doing in the newspaper at the Folha de São Paulo, from Folha de São Paulo to academia and then research at IBM. Some point when I was doing this research when I was undergrad student, I got super interested on doing research, and then at that time, I decided to go all in into the academia, right? And this is one of the possibilities, right? So I applied to this position at University of Campinas, Unicamp, and then I joined a project that was running under supervision of Professor Cecilia Baranauskas, and then there was a scholarship for me there, and I was able to work and study full-time there over the next years. So this is one of the ways of engaging with research, I would say. So receiving scholarships over the years. Back in Brazil, when people are in this full-time dedication, it's expected for a good time for a master's project is kind of 2 to 3 years, and for PhDs the regular time is 4-year period for the whole thing. And I would say for the PhD, usually when we are doing that, we need to conclude, have some credits, right? And then the PhD thesis. That is somewhat half and half. So if you have 4 years, usually you keep your 2 first years to conclude all the credits, and then to focus on the dissertation. Sometimes people do start if they have already a really good idea of a project and it's a fit for the supervisor, then can be theses from the day one, right? Especially if you are coming already with some background on the area from the master degrees, then it helps a lot. So, and for instance, my case, it was the next step. The PhD was the next step over my master's project. So I had a backlog of publications. I had a backlog of ideas. So it was more in the sense of getting deeper on that subject, right? So that is one way. And to your point on the period, I decided that if I was doing full time, I was do as fast as I can, because I wanted to apply that. I wanted to finish as fast as I could. And at the time, I had this scholarship that was for 3 years, and then was also another, let's say, motivator. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks very much for that. That's interesting. So for anyone sort of not familiar with sort of the world of PhDs, there are, it might be surprising or it might make sense, but some people do actually sort of start the PhD without necessarily having a very clear idea of what they want to work on, and that can be in any subject, right? But I can say, from my own experience, having gone in for my own doctorate with a very clear idea of what I wanted to do, you will probably finish a lot faster if you sort of like have a sort of worked out idea and plan. But of course, that involves a lot of work to get there. So you've kind of front loaded it before you start the PhD. If you're in like if you've done that kind of thing already. So that was really interesting. And as I said, if your scholarship runs out after 3 years, that's a great incentive to finish, because as a student, you're probably not living the high life anyway. And so, would you mind actually talking a little bit? I know it's been 10 years, but would you mind talking a little bit about what your PhD thesis was about?
Sure. I mentioned about finding the area of usability and accessibility. I really like to understand ways that we could do user interaction to be as simple as possible and to be efficient, to be effective, and people feel satisfied after using that. I started looking into some papers and books around the subject. And when I started thinking about master project, in fact, the thing that I thought at the beginning ended up as being the whole thing, like my master and PhD, because what I wanted to do at the very beginning was too big to fit in a master's project. And I started to explore piece by piece, right? And then the first thing I was concerned about was that we always need to have this kind of data super well structured to analyze what happened, and we need to have clicks and this kind of analysis. And I was thinking about, okay, but what if we start analyzing everything, instead of using one type of event like click, we have tens of events triggered while we interact with computers, and we can customize, we can trigger more events. We can have, nowadays we have more devices that trigger even more events. What if I could analyze all those events and think about how people interact different ways? And then when I started to research about this topic, I really found that universal design was the philosophy I would like to follow, because it is something that opens your mind to so many different possibilities. And with the help from Professor Baranauskas, I was super intrigued about the possibilities that universal design and also what universal design brings to you when you're thinking about possibilities. Because usually we say, okay, let's analyze clicks, but does everyone use mouse? What about blind people? Then you start thinking, okay, but we can analyze if users did this and that, or if they downloaded something. But what about places that the connectivity is not so good? So we can even analyze the speed that the images are being downloaded, because sometimes we can see that things are not working properly because the internet connection. And then I started to see that there was this whole range of possibilities of analyzing this really rich data set about how things actually happened. And for instance, when I started to research about usability, there's this whole idea that when we freeze, we don't know what to do when we are looking at a user interface. You're trying to make sense of that. What should I do? Where can I go? And then even the lack of interaction is an interesting information that you can consider. Like, right, if people are moving and then suddenly they change the speed they're using the mouse, or they suddenly change the way that the speed that they are typing. So what does that mean if you start analyzing the nuances of this information and the possibilities of combining everything? Like, okay, and my first idea was, how can I differentiate or analyze differences between when people that is using the mouse, for instance, navigating through a newspaper website or an e-commerce, like, okay, I just entered and I want to go to this link. It's just to move the mouse over the 2D screen. But for people that are using screen readers, and screen readers are those systems that read the content behind the curtains, right? We have structural and textual information, and the screen readers usually they bring this information for people that cannot see, or even people that use screen readers as an additional modality to also hear what is in the screen. And if we have, let's say, blind people using the same web page I mentioned before, probably they will have to tab over the links, navigate through some structure. So instead of reaching, starting from A and going to B, like in one straight line in a few seconds, probably this other person will have to traverse like multiple links until they reach the same point. So we have different ways of doing that. And I thought about creating a system that could first identify those differences. And the second aspect, how can I improve the UI, the user interface for everybody? Like to make these accessible to the most extent possible. And that's where universal design comes into place, because it's the idea that you shouldn't create one specific solution for each specific group of people based on their abilities. You should create one that tries to bring everybody to the same level, right? It brings it allows everyone to use the same way. And the classic example is the supermarket automatic door, right? When you're entering, the sensor doesn't know if you're carrying a baby, if you're using a wheelchair, if you're using a white can, if you're blind, if you're if you're walking, you just enter, and the sensors identifies you, and the doors open after that. That's the classic example usually gave when we talk about universal design. But when we're talking about computers, we need to think about the modalities and how people might, let's say, decode that information, right? So we can think about, okay, if I'm providing this information in a textual way, is it well structured to the point that a screen reader can access that and decode that for people that cannot see, And also sign language. Is there a way to convert that textual information in English or in Portuguese, for instance, to the sign language of that region? And when you start to think about all of these possibilities, then I really got interested in doing something around that. And after researching even more, I also changed a bit the way of looking at this problem, because at the beginning, I was like everybody, too much focused on disabilities, on types of disabilities. But if you start paying attention to the word around, you see that it's not so much about the disability, because if you think about one specific type of disability, let's say blindness, well, I need to use glasses because I cannot see in a certain distance. And if we see lots of technologies and lots of research projects dealing with one type of accessibility or one type of disability, and in discrete way, or if you either you have or you don't have. But in the real world, it's not this way. When we get older, we'll have multiple types of disabilities or limitations that are in this continuum from a mild to severe or something. And this, just to talk about this discrete versus continuum way of looking at different abilities. But also the context of use, because, well, right, if we are, let's say, listening to music, and then our cell phone just rings, our my hearing capabilities are not available to that channel, to that modality. So accessibility goes beyond the disability and is more related to the context of use, right? If the modality, if that specific situation, I can use all my capabilities. Because when you start talking about accessibility, I've heard that a couple of times, but you're talking only about 5% of the population, or even 10%, 12%. And when we talk about universal design, now we are talking about everybody, because it is situational. It's not something that either you have or you don't have. It depends on the situation. So if you see a ramp, but you're not in a sidewalk, well, if you don't use a wheelchair, you think that is not for you. But if you're carrying your baby in a stroller, then it's for you as well. If you're carrying a supermarket cart or something, you can use that. So it's a way of changing your mindset to see all of these possibilities. And I try to apply that in this specific area of capturing data and trying to see, okay, what are these possibilities, these multiple flows I mentioned before? We have groups of people that go from A to B really fast, really quick in a few steps. But there's this other group that goes this challenging way with lots of steps to reach the same point B. What can we do? And to summarize, my project was like on getting this data, understanding or trying to identify these problems or these barriers, and with a way of applying these rules, we could apply small adjustments to the UI and identify if that improved or not. So basically, cluster groups of people based on the way they interact, not by the way that by disabilities, because, for instance, I don't use mouse, but I use keyboard a lot. And when assistive technology that benefits blind users will also benefit people that use keyboard a lot. We will have lots of way of interacting and shortcuts and so on. So that was the first way thing that I brought, like analyzing the data based on interaction, not on the capabilities, right? And then if I have these multiple possibilities, ones that are faster, others that took loops and some different paths, how can I improve those UIs to get to help these people to get the same point in fewer steps? And then there was the tool basically had a few rules, and there was this way of creating these adjustments. And based on these clusters, first the system identifies what are the adjustments that can be applied to that cluster, and then divides each cluster in an experimental and a control group, and then applies and analyzes in this next visits how and if that path was improved or not. So that's the whole story behind the system. But it tries to make one simple thing, that is to get the number of actions as short as possible for everybody. But there's this whole tooling aspect done under the hood that involves capturing data in a lightweight manner, transferring to somewhere else, also to identify these multiple paths and how people are interacting with the UI, performing this clusterization of this kind of data sets, and then applying this, identifying properly what are the adjustments that should be applied to this and that. So the adjustments are supposed to be small improvements or changes. We only know if it improved or not in the subsequent visits. But imagine that you have a small link on a certain page that some people can, like, let's say a logout link. Some people can easily move the mouse over and then click and log out. So we have this path, this short set of actions. But we have also people that try to click on that link, and the link is so small for that specific group that they have the mouse to hover out to go out this element. They click outside, and then they hover over the link again, and then click. So we have an additional click. We have click on a non-clickable area. So these are rich information we can use. And for instance, one adjustment for this specific situation could be try increasing in 10% the size of this link. And in the next visit, we analyze the whole set. Okay, for this next visit, did it improve or not? If not, we can increase again, or just you can forget that specific rule because it's not working. So just forget. But the whole idea was to apply these small adjustments and see if that improved or not the UI.
Thanks very much for that. It's interesting. You captured sort of a lot of the range of the kind of sort of things that people who are involved in human computer action have to get involved with, which includes sort of like really thinking through things at a deep level about what human computer interaction is, right? And so like I love when you mentioned it's situational. You reminded me of a very specific image actually of I interviewed a Leanpub author, and she had been using our on her laptop, she'd been using our in-browser editor writing mode, right? So you write in the browser, but she'd recently had a baby. And so now she was one-handed. And when you mentioned this sort of ramp, I mean, a lot of people think, oh, that's for, like, and it's sort of like you did invoke, there's sometimes people get kind of sarcastic or even negative about it. They'll be like, why are you designing this whole thing for 5% of the population? And it's like, well, what if someone's got a cart of groceries? What if they're pulling behind them? What if they've had a baby and now they've got a stroller or something like that? And there's all kinds of other things. What if they've, kind of been injured, and steps are suddenly difficult? What if you break your hand, all of a sudden one-handed kind of things, and, and maybe it's your mouse hand that you've lost temporarily, things like that. And so being able to design to all of these things, isn't just for sort of like, it's much more complex and sort of, as you say, there's sort of universal than just there's specific types of people who are sort of coherently self-contained who have coherently self-contained problems. And you need to design something for every case if you can. But that reminds me of something I was looking at. I think it's a relatively recent paper that you worked on about computer anxiety. And so it's interesting. You talk about what happens in between the clicks, all that kind of stuff. But there's actually even before there's this human computer interaction problem that happens even before people get to the computer, which is they're anxious about interacting with computers. And I remember once having a very striking example of that. I'd moved to a new place, and I was at the post office, and I was doing something, and there was a guy in front of me who was my age, who was getting a post office box. And the employee at the post office asked him for his email address, and he said, "Oh, I never learned computers." And it was just so striking because, like, to me, I take it for granted that I use computers all the time for everything. They don't usually frighten me too much. I'm not too intimidated by them. But there are a lot, and like, not to be too presumptuous about this guy, but like, there are a lot of people for whom like the computer is this, like, just a big scary thing. I remember a BBC tech writer years ago wrote about how, like, he didn't dare tell his mom that her remote control for her television was actually a computer, because if he told her, she'd stop using it. Just generally speaking on computer anxiety, can you talk a little bit about the sort of, like, I guess, sort of scholarly or kind of scientific approach to what that really is and what you can do to address it?
Sure. Computer anxiety, I got interested about that specific topic when I started trying to map all the barriers people face, and specifically this richer context related to the interaction. And as I mentioned, when we talk about barriers, most of the time we are focused on the interaction itself. while people are interacting. And when I started reading about computer anxiety, I got interested because it's a barrier that may occur before the actual interaction. So people feel that they're going to do something wrong, right? They feel that, okay, it's not going to happen. And this whole idea that it's not going to work, it's going to break, I look stupid using that, this brings so heavy burden to these people that they start the interaction with lots of preconceived ideas, right? And what literature says is that usually people that feel this way, they didn't have the opportunity to interact with computers in a meaningful way. And I mean, usually they had their first experience in a bad way. They have it was a computer in a, let's say, a shared computer, and they were afraid of breaking or deleting something or looking stupid when using, of making mistakes. And usually this differentiation is something that pops up when we are discussing, because usually people say, but I have my grandson doesn't care, or he does a lot of stuff. And usually kids do because they aren't afraid of breaking stuff, right? And this is the first barrier that usually we have. Okay, am I doing this right way? Am I going to break something? And this fear of also looking stupid in front of others, it's something that ends up holding people back, because they are afraid of showing up that they don't know. And this just makes things worse and worse, right? And we also try to study the role of mobile phones on that, because usually people, if you have your smartphone, your mobile phone, you are comfortable in doing things and you're the only people seeing what you're doing. So that is something, is an interesting aspect of the role of smartphones for people with computer anxieties. They can explore stuff. And that it's something that we saw in the literature as well. And in this specific research, we, and I'm saying we because it is part of a PhD project I'm supervising from a university of, the Federal University of ABC in Brazil. I'm a collaborator there, and I'm supervising this PhD project. And the idea is to use the data set I mentioned before, so tens of events that we can capture, and see if and how we can simplify user interface for this population. Because as time passes and with technical education or with experience, we can reduce this kind of anxiety. And this is also present in the literature. But what if we can bring meaningful first experiences for this group of people, and to make user interface as simple as possible for them? So if we have lots of distractors, and we can easily see that lots of applications and websites and systems we have nowadays, they have so many distractors like advertisement, things moving around, and these kinds of things end up calling attention to different things that are not related to the main task, right? Or to the things that people want to do. And we are trying to use this data set to identify, first, what is the task people are performing? And second, is there anything that I can remove from the UI right now for this specific task, for this specific people? And then we are trying to do this automatically. So basically using this kind of data, trying to have multiple ways of identify these distractors. And we started using eye tracker to see how people interact with eye gazes around the UI for a specific reduced set of tasks. And we also thought that, well, having an eye tracker on every single, let's say, personal computer is not feasible for some populations, for instance, in Brazil. And then what if we could use a more common data set, like mouse movements, as a proxy to gaze interaction? And then we are trying to identify these distractors. And this is only part of the whole challenge of first identifying the task and then the distractors and then simplifying when it makes sense. But I think that's it. This is this whole pipeline of identifying first people that have these higher levels of computer anxiety, then identifying the task, and then identifying what are the distractors for them, and then trying to simplify the UI for that specific person performing that specific task. So
yeah, that's so fascinating. I mean, in the end of the whole, we'll actually talk a little bit probably about data and how you actually gather it, right? Because you said, you've got to have, when we're talking about like eye movements and stuff like that, well, there's got to be something looking at it. And there's hopefully someone who opted in to agree to have their eye movements tracked and stuff like that, but which is a super sensitive thing in all this kind of analysis. But I just wanted to point out that, like, in addition to, computer anxiety, and I'm now going to just make up my own term. There's computer hostility, that's sort of like getting a little bit, kind of going away now. But it reminds me of a very specific thing that happened in kind of the corporate world, which was that one of the reasons, if anyone remembers the old BlackBerries, which were these mobile phones, but mobile computing devices that had a little physical keypad on them. And one of the reasons they became just so explosively popular in the business world was that there's a certain kind of business executive culture in which typing on a keyboard is seen as a lower status activity. That's the kind of thing a worker does, not the kind of thing a boss does. And the idea that you even knew how to kind of type for people, I'm going to be generalizing negatively here, but for people of a certain generation, was actually kind of like a marker of lower status. And so when finally people didn't have to sit at a keyboard and type like a typist, and they could actually just sort of do things with their thumbs, that type of interaction unlocked all this amazing technology that these executives could finally use in a kind of culturally acceptable way. And it's amazing. So in addition to computer hostility, there's basically a kind of whole political dimension to this kind of stuff. And that can come up. There's like, with sort of status symbols and things like that. But again, in particular, there's this, like, once the kind of work that people do on human computer interaction can actually unlock, like powers for people but in many ways. And it's not always as sort of technical as it were of sort of gathering data, but there can be these high level kind of things that happen, which make it such a fascinating field. But just moving on that topic. So, your book is called Interaction Data Analytics. So let's sort of get into the heart of this here. So before we start talking specifically about how you get the data, I was wondering if you could talk about what interaction logs are.
Sure. I mentioned about this whole idea that people have about focusing too much on clicks, right? And then after researching about this subject, I started seeing that there's so many possibilities in this, let's say, in a log that you can have more information. And when I started researching about tools and different analytics platforms that usually back in the 90s and early 2000s, we had like analysis of server logs. And at that time that was the data source people used on research and so on, because it is the natural product of web servers working. So we have everything there. But when you start trying to get more information about how people actually use that, then this kind of data source is not that useful, because again, it has the page views or the downloaded pages or the requests, more specifically saying. So we don't know what happened between these requests. We can have requests that are triggered automatically. Nowadays, we have screens that triggers lots of requests, right? And then I started looking into these possibilities of kind of using all available events, combining them, creating new events, and then about thinking, oh, what if I have like an additional sensor? If I had like a sensor that could detect how much pressure I put in a touch screen, what if I had like a sensor that could detect my skin conductance to identify events of frustration? What if we had like an eye tracking that I could detect my pupil dilation or something, right? Then we have lots of things that we can capture. We have the so famous click that is kind of an explicit way of doing something, right? And but we have lots of other types of information that we can capture and have really interesting insights from that. So we have the way that you move the mouse, the way, and recently what we saw that is interesting also is the interval that you stop over a link before clicking on it. It's an interesting predictor for some of the machine learning models we are creating. Or any sort of interesting attribute to be more technically, to be technically correct. So after looking around of this range of possibilities, I saw that, okay, it's beyond only looking to certain kinds of information. And when I started trying to look around a term, I didn't find a term that could encompasses everything. And then I said, okay, logs, we use logs, server logs from every from multiple systems. But to have this specifically analysis of interaction, then we should have something that could cover this whole variety of data. And then we started discussing, okay, we have any kind of data that we can get that is a result from the interaction. We are calling interaction data. And if we capture a bunch of these, we were calling interaction log. Because, again, after interacting with systems, we are trying to cover really the whole variety. Because if we talk about IoT, for instance, we have information of people entering and leaving, let's say, a museum. And this way of looking to technology actually gave birth to lots of patents I have in IBM, because it's a way of analyzing how people interact with technologies and try to see, okay, what if let's say, collect data of how people interact with an environment, and the newcomer comes into this environment and they don't know how to interact with people and with the environment. What if I use all the possibilities and how people usually interact to inform this newcomer to this environment? So it would be like a way of presenting the social protocols around that specific environment for a newcomer. So we can think about a museum. We can think about this situation like in an airport or in a smart city or in transit, right? If you're driving here in New York or in Sao Paulo, you'll see different behaviors. Some of them are acceptable, some of them are not. So And we could use like logs from cars, like how do you sign when you are changing lanes? How do you behave using lights when you dim, when you keep your, it's this whole range of possibilities of getting this specific piece of data of how people interact with systems.
Yeah, that's super interesting. One thing you touched on there was you said explicit interaction, and then another you introduced these terms at the beginning of the book, and then there's this term implicit interaction. Explicit interaction is kind of what you consciously choose to do, more or less, right? Like I'm going to move the mouse over there, and I'm going to click on that button, and I'm going to buy that whatever, or go to that link. And then implicit interaction is like what you were talking about, like like involuntary eye movements, or kind of skin conduction or something like that, where you can sort of sense people's anxieties, or even you can even imagine like sort of heart rates or something like that, right? Which is really interesting, and it's interesting too that you mentioned sort of like introducing people to things. That reminded me, I think the opening of Super Mario Brothers is sort of famous in the gaming world for like, in the first minute, you kind of have to survive the first minute. You kind of have to learn everything you're going to need to know. And they very consciously designed the beginning of the game that way. But, when it comes to museums, for example, when you walk in and sort of walking in and even knowing what to do or where to go is actually hopefully part of the design of what's happened there. And so these kinds of interaction logs are sort of useful not only for websites but for all kinds of different things, and the same kind of principles apply. And you mentioned patents, so we haven't really talked too much about or at all about your work for IBM, but if people are interested what a master inventor is, and sort of this is in general, what kind of work do you do have you been doing for them for the last 10 years?
Yeah, well, IBM is known for one of the companies that was in the top of companies with more patents than the USPTO. IBM was the leader for 29 years in a row in this rank of companies patenting technologies, and it's part of the culture in the company. And when I started learning about that, I got super interested in I had with a few colleagues and friends, like some of the most incredible brainstormings I had in my whole life, like thinking about new technologies, how to solve problems with people from different backgrounds, bringing different contributions to the table. And this is basically part of our daily work at IBM Research, and also in other business units. But I think specifically inside IBM Research is really present, so to say, for my, at least based on my experience. And well, as soon as I started this whole journey on patenting and understanding what a patent is, and how to create a patent, how a patent differs from a paper, and all this stuff. And I invited a mentor, one a friend that was already a master inventor at the time, and he taught me a lot about the process, about doing patent, about preparing the documentation. And a few years later, I was nominated as master inventor. Master inventor is an internal title at IBM, and it is a temporary one because it lasts for 3 years. So basically, you need to keep up inventing to maintain the title, so to say. That's basically what it means. But also, as part of this title, the master inventor title, is that you're supposed to help people that want to start patenting or start exploring these possibilities. So as a master inventor, we are encouraged to mentor people interested on patenting, and also interested in the whole process of innovation, and how it connects with IBM's business and how it connects with the role that our labs have inside IBM research. So it's interesting to connect with this way of impacting the IBM's patent portfolio. And well, I really like this this part of my job because it's super challenging and super. I'd say that when we have a patent granted, it's really interesting because we have a whole process inside IBM that we have boards that assess the idea, and we have this approval internally and the whole document preparation, and then it's submitted to USPTO, which is the trademark and patent office here in the US, and then there's this another assessment in USPTO. So when you have an idea, something that you created with your colleagues and friends, and passes this whole workflow, and at the end, there's an expert on patents that says, okay, this is really new. This has something new, and it is worth a patent, and it's worth to be granted. So it's really how should I say? It's revigorating. You'll see that something that you came up was passed through this whole workflow and was assessed as a valuable stuff, right? And it's new, and that's really, really cool when it happens.
Yeah, it sounds like such an interesting job. I mean, you get to work with all these really smart people. You get to sort of write papers and sort of work on cutting edge, not just technologies, but ideas and things like that. And for anyone listening who hasn't been through it before, I've been sort of, in a way, I was part of a project that ended up getting a U.S. patent. And in the end, you sort of submit your ideas to some people at the U.S. Trademark and Patent Office who decide whether it really is a new and unique thing. And that's got to be a kind of interesting job, of course, as well. But to get that validation that you really have done something new in the world must be really exciting. I did mention earlier that I would ask about actually how you go about in sort of, let's say, your ordinary human computer interaction experimentation. How do you actually get data? So do you get a group of volunteers and sort of set them up in like a lab in front of a bunch of computers where they've got their heart monitor or there's something on their finger or something like that to, how does that actually work?
Well, it can be done in different ways. We can have this local user session, as you mentioned, when we have like this whole process that we must do in research, like going to an IRB board to have the project assessed, and then we need to present a consent form and make sure that people understand that they are participating in a study. And then for specifically for this one that you mentioned about computer anxiety, that's how it was done. Basically, and for this one around computer anxiety, we partnered with a community center in downtown São Paulo that supports older adults in that area. So they offer multiple services to older adults, and we were in this partnership with this, and my PhD student and this center, and we have to communicate to the participants and make sure that they understand what is the study about and what are the data that we are collecting. And well, as we do by the book, like explain things, and if they can interrupt their participation anytime. So we go we follow we follow the standard protocols for doing that, right? this for local studies. We can also do like remote studies. And usually when we talk about scale and we want to know more about information, then usually we inform this and require consent for capturing certain types of data. Nowadays we have regulations for cookies, for instance, and how to explain that, what kind of information, what's your cookie policy, what are the goals of using that information. And for the research I mentioned before related to interaction data analytics, usually we present that, we inform also the types of data we are capturing, how we're going to use that. And this is done only under users' consent. So that's, I'd say that is the big difference from one to the other context. And the hard thing is that when we do local studies, usually we're not able to have like hundreds or thousands of sessions due to space, time, money limitations in research as in general. But for these local studies, we end up having really rich information about the interaction and about how people felt during that specific interaction. We get opinion, we see how they change their facial expressions while interacting with the system we are studying. But on the other hand, when we go to scale, we have more data of how multiple people used that specific system we are evaluating, but then we miss something of that detail that we have when we are doing in-person session. So it's a balance that usually we try to have, and depends on the system we are creating. It depends also the way that you recruit participants, voluntaries. Sometimes you need to have a group of participants with certain characteristics to represent somehow the population that you want to that system to be meaningful and easy to use. So it's a tricky thing to do and to design this kind of experiment. But yeah, this is the difference. In one situation, we need to explain, we follow the protocols, and we have this kind of partnership and multiple ways of recruiting participants and also doing everything under the consent. And when we do like remote at scale studies, we need to inform people that we are capturing certain types of data. What are we going to do with that specific type of data, and how they can opt out. For instance, the study, we need to get a contact person for that specific study, so on and so forth.
Speaking of reaching the right population, I did mention your book, Interaction Data Analytics, and I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about, I know we've covered a lot of the topics that are in there, but obviously, but I was wondering if you could talk just a little bit about who the book is for.
Yeah, I mentioned about this kind of gap that I saw between using state-of-the-art, let's say, algorithms and techniques of data analysis, and sometimes and how to design experiments to capture certain nuances and certain details of how people interact with systems. So first, I thought about kind of summarizing and how I could help people in the same with the same interest, and also try to get some structure, because as I mentioned, I'm researching about this subject for some time, and when I interact with people that are interested in this subject, and then they ask for references, and I usually send a couple of papers that I did write with colleagues, or other papers I used as reference, and usually they have to kind of connect everything. I did teach a couple of courses around interaction data analysis, and I thought after a couple of these courses, I thought about having this collection or this thing from start to finish, talking about how to think about universal design, as I mentioned before, how to plan the data capture and how to collect the data, how to analyze and visualize. And these steps started this idea of, okay, what if I read a book about that, like combining everything I did in these years and leveraging the structure of the courses I already taught. So it was like this idea of having something that could tell this story for people interested in this specific aspect, like bridging let's say UX to data science. So that how can we do that connection, right? How can we think about user tests to capture interesting data and get that data and transform somehow in a complex structure like a graph or a table with certain metrics I'm interested in, and then visualizing thousands of people interacting with that specific technology, or even creating a machine learning model to do something interesting around that specific type of data. So I thought as being something that I could handle, like, or suggest to someone asking me, okay, I like that. I like this topic. What do you recommend? And then I thought about the book as being this thing I would recommend. Okay, this is not the whole story, but it's a good start for you to have a sense of what can be done and how you can explore this kind of data with different tools and applications. So that in short is the whole motivation behind the book.
Yeah, well, thanks very much for that. It's a great project, and it's a great looking project. And I just wanted to talk to you a little bit about a couple of details about it. So we say for the last part of the interview, if the guest is an author, so a little bit about their process. And the book is currently marked as 25% complete. So you're writing it in progress. And I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about what your approach is to that way of publishing. Do you have a plan? Like, I'm going to work on it for 5 hours a week and publish one chapter a month, or something like that?
Yeah, well, the first time I've heard about Leanpub was in a conference, and it was like few colleagues. They were just transitioning from a different publisher to Leanpub, and they recommended. And then I started reading about the whole proposed and different way of publishing. And the first I have two books. This one you mentioned that is Interaction Data Analytics, that it's in progress, and it's 25% because based on the material I have in mind and the courses I mentioned, I thought about it. I think it will be a book around 200 pages. So we have 50 pages. So that's how I'm planning that.
Yeah.
And well, I have some material. The material I have nowadays is in Portuguese. So I'm trying to get some of the papers and results I have recently obtained recently in this more fluid way along the book. But back to the point on publishing on Leanpub is that I had this project called Varal in the past that was about helping people to make accessible and usable code for websites.
Just so we're clear.
It's an acronym, so it's WARAU. Okay. So it's and it's available leanpub.com/Varal, which is
I've got it right here. That's what comes from. Okay, got it.
And then this was about a project that there was this website hosted at Unicamp. That time I was doing my transition from master degree to the PhD degree, and then there was this website. It was the reference website with lots of code, lots of examples for people to do things daily basis. And one thing at that time that we identify is that when people start thinking about accessibility or usability, they sometimes leave at the end of the project, and that never comes up, right? We are always late coding stuff. So we thought about kind of digesting and creating lots of examples on how to, for instance, how to make accessible tables, accessible structure, and for multiple reasons. And then we have all of these examples in the website. And then, well, it was complicated to maintain the website due to some security issues. Then I thought about, okay, I've heard about Leanpub. What if we just get all the examples of the codes and the theories we have? It was not in a linear structure in the website. But then after discussing with the co-authors, we had at that time kind of suggested one sequence of reading that, like going from some aspects to other more complicated ones. And at that time, we also identified the need for a reference in Portuguese for this specific subject. Then I thought, okay, if I would try just converting the website as a book, and then was the first book we published on Leanpub. And then with this one, I had these materials about the courses I taught and the papers I've been publishing. And then I thought, okay, probably I will not have time to put my head on this project for like the period I need. But I have the whole plan. I need to get it progressing. And I was afraid of losing the time of doing that.
Right.
So, because as I mentioned, I see value on that. I see that there's something happening in this specific area. And I was like, I felt that I need to do something when I start seeing some new positions, like on LinkedIn or in different other platforms, talking about this connection. And so, okay, it's not only so other people are also seeing value on this connection between UX and data science. So I should do it and also do it in a way that I can make the best of the feedback that I can have and make it as a more iterative process than something that it's a one-time thing. So that's how I got to know Leanpub, and then I had this first experience just transitioning from this website, this reference website we had to the Leanpub, and then with this idea of this book, I had already an idea for the cover. I had an idea of the whole structure of the book, and there was something missing. Then I said, okay, lots of things to do, lots of patents, lots of papers. So I need to get something done so that I can iterate over that. So that was the idea behind that. And again, I have the whole structure, the whole idea of the book, and basically is to convert some of the courses I taught in a more fluid way with references, with lots of examples, trying to structure in a more formal way with certain definitions, trying also to invite people to think more about the definitions and things we have, and to get trying to make people more aware of these definitions and how the literature already treats that, so they shouldn't get too worried about hypes or influenced by hypes on certain terms. So that's the idea behind publishing it as on parts. So and to answer your question, you mentioned about plans. I don't have a specific plan of concluding it or a specific deadline. But one thing that I want to do is like to have like these chunks, like 50 pages, for instance. So if I had to say, I'm planning on having like more 3 chunks of 50 pages added to this book throughout this year and the next one. So this is the I'd say the way that I see the project right now. But again, that's my it might change. But I'm planning on adding these chunks of 50 pages and improving as well as possible and making the best of the feedback that community can also provide. And well, and it's funny because before starting this book, I had the idea, and after piloting the short course I mentioned, one person said, "Okay, you should write a book about it." And I said, "I'm doing this. I just don't have the time to put everything together, but I'm doing this, and it's on my backlog. So now I'm just trying to bring this from the backlog to the in progress part of my Kanban and to have iterations over that."
Yeah, thanks very much for sharing that great story. That's so interesting to hear about both of the projects and how sort of Leanpub turned out to be useful. I mean, in particular, of course, feedback and stuff like that, getting feedback while you're writing, but also kind of just getting something out there is sort of one of the reasons we exist, right? Is sort of like so that you don't have to have a completed book and you don't have to sort of face the daunting task of writing a whole book before you get something out there and actually start playing a role in the conversation. If it's if just people are talking about these ideas and things like that, get it out there, be playing a role, but in sort of book format, but before it's finished. So that's fantastic. And the last question I always ask on the podcast, if the guest is a Leanpub author, is if there was one magical feature we could build for you, or if there was one thing you really hate about Leanpub that we could fix for you, can you think of anything that you would ask us to do?
Well, as researcher, I use Overleaf a lot for writing papers in LaTeX. So some way of connecting Overleaf to Leanpub, I think that would be really interesting. Or maybe some way of integrating. Well, nowadays, what we are doing is like we are using Overleaf to write it, and then I generate the PDF and then upload the PDF to Leanpub. And well, I like the idea of using LaTeX because it generates PDFs with good accessibility level due to the whole markup. So this is one aspect that we are interested also, and I think that's it because again I'm using Overleaf because lots of materials I have and the references, they are also from papers I've written and materials I have. So and I like the way that some documents look as well, not only under the hood, like the accessibility and the whole structure. We are able to create really good looking documents. So that's why I like using LaTeX and to answer your question, I think that connecting maybe with Overleaf could be an interesting plus. But again, more for researchers and nerds like me that like using Overleaf instead of other processing or.
Yeah, no, great. Thanks very much for that feedback. That's really interesting, and it's definitely something I'll let the team know about. Yeah, it's just so that's one of the things I really like about doing these interviews is finding like all the very specific things that people from different like people from academic area, like institutions might approach things one way. People from big companies might approach them another way. People who are just completely independent might approach them another way. And I went and I was actually very curious too, because I saw you were using our upload writing mode, and then to see what tools you were using to produce this great looking book. So thanks very much for sharing that. And yeah, thanks also very much for taking the time to be out of your afternoon today to be on the Front Matter podcast.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. I really enjoyed it.
Thanks. And as always, thanks to all of you for listening to this episode of the Front Matter podcast. If you like what you heard, please rate and review it wherever you found it. And if you'd like to be a Leanpub author yourself, please check out our website at leanpub.com. Thanks.